G'day viewers. In this segment we'll talk about the issue of packet fragmentation. So our topic here is really an issue that arises because of the heterogeneity of different networks. When we connect networks together, they might have different maximum packet sizes that can go through the network. If that's the case, you could send a large packet in one network and it wouldn't fit through in another portion of the network. We need some way to handle this issue, and in this video we'll look at a couple of different approaches. One is simply having routers inside the network split the packet up into pieces, each of which will fit through a link because it's not too big. And an alternative to that is having hosts discover what size packet will fit through the network. So let's just recap some of the problem here before we dive into the details of the solution. The problem, in a nutshell, is that different networks have different maximum packet sizes. You'll often see this referred to as an MTU, or maximum transmission unit. That's just a fancy way of saying the largest packet which will fit through this network. It'd be wonderful if we could just kind of mandate one single maximum packet size. Then everything would be simple. A lot of this issue would go away. Well, maybe, in theory. But this is not the case. This is never going to happen. All sorts of different kinds of network technologies have different maximum transmission unit sizes. We're stuck with this problem for many reasons. Just as a quick example, the Ethernets we've talked about, the very popular wired technology, permit packets up to about 1.5 kilobytes. On the other hand, Wi-Fi, and this is garden variety for both of these technologies, permits packets up to about 2.3 kilobytes. And different versions of Ethernet and Wi-Fi actually have different maximum packet sizes that they will allow through. So we're really stuck with this issue. Now the problem arises because not only do different networks carry different packet sizes, but we would like to send packets that are as large as will fit through the network. The reason for this is because of efficiency. If we send large packets, we'll spend fewer bits sending those headers, and routers will also have to process fewer packets to get the same amount of information through. So we want a large size. But what large size? What size is too large and what size is okay? This is difficult to work out because a host on the network knows how big packets it can send through the link to which it's attached, but it doesn't know what size packets will fit through somewhere way on the other side of the network if it's sending packets to a particular destination out there. There are two different kinds of solutions that we'll look at to this problem. One is fragmentation, which is simply the word for splitting a large packet up into smaller pieces that will fit through the network. This is the classic method that's used in IP. It's somewhat dated now and is depreciated in favor of another method. The other method that we'll look at is a discovery method. This is a method that hosts can use to find ahead of time the largest packet which will fit through the network. Once they know this, they can simply use this size and they'll avoid unnecessary fragmentation. Okay, so let's look at how fragmentation works. This picture shows an overall setup. I have a source here on the left and a destination here on the right. And I simply want to send a packet across. Now, the way fragmentation works, fragmentation will happen at routers inside the network. Our source here sends a big packet, the biggest packet which would fit on its link, its first link, and it looks like that's fairly big. When we get to some router, any router in the network, if that packet is too large to fit on the outgoing links, then the router will fragment it. And you can see that's exactly what happens at this first router. We've now divided the packet into two different fragments. A long one, which was probably the longest size that fit over that link, and then a leftover chunk. Well, those fragments then proceed through the network. They're routed independently. The other routers treat them all as individual packets, as it were. And these pieces will then go through the network and arrive at the destination. When they're at the destination will do the hard work of reassembling these pieces, putting them back together, completing the jigsaw puzzle to produce the original packet. And that original packet will then be handed up to the transport layer. So the transport layer won't know whether or not there was fragmentation. You'll note here that there's a little bit of asymmetry. Fragmentation happens at routers where it needs to happen because the packet simply couldn't go onwards, it was too big. But reassembly happens at the ultimate receiving host. And the reason for this is to reduce the load on routers. We don't want them to have to reassemble the pieces, buffer things, and complete a jigsaw puzzle to put them back together. That's a lot of work, potentially, and we would like to push all of this work to the end host where we can to reduce the amount of work routers have to do so they can forward packets at a very high rates. So going into more detail for fragmentation, fragmentation information is conveyed using header fields on the IP packet. I'm showing you here a picture of the format of the IPv4 header. This is the same picture we've seen before, and I've shaded in pink some of the fields which are used for fragmentation. We'll see how in just a minute. So those fields are identification. This sort of provides a number on a packet, so we'll have a stamp that's unique for a packet that we can use to put pieces of it together if it's broken. There is a total length field that's highlighted because the length field will change if we break the packet into pieces. We'll update it to reflect the length of the pieces, not the complete packet. There's a fragment offset field. This field is used to indicate where in the overall packet the fragment belongs, what its offset or position is. And then there are a couple of control bits. MF here stands for more fragments. That's used to indicate whether there are any more pieces. So in this way, a receiving host can know whether it has all of the pieces of a fragment, or all of the fragments of a packet. There's also DF, which we'll see later, which is don't fragment. It's used to turn fragmentation off. Okay, so with these fields, now let's go through the procedure that's used to perform fragmentation. So when routers receive a packet which is too large, they'll begin fragmentation. To do that, they need to divide the packet into pieces. Typically, they'll break it into large pieces. The largest piece, which will fit across the next link, and whatever's left over after that. And you could break it into more than two pieces too. We're just using two in our examples here. You then copy the IP header to all of the different pieces because each different piece needs to be routable through the network, and routers need to have an IP header on packets so they can work out what to do. Then you adjust the length on the pieces so that the length reflects the fragment, not the overall packet. You set an offset in the fragment offset field to indicate the position of this fragment in the overall packet, so we'll know how to put them together. And finally, you use the MF, the more fragments flag, as a single bit to indicate whether there are any more fragments. This is fairly clever because when we turn this bit on, as soon as a host at the end receives any packet with the more fragments bit on, it knows the packet has been fragmented and it should put all of the pieces together. And it will look for all of the pieces until eventually it will find a last piece that has this flag cleared and it knows that it's got to the end. The receiving host reassembles these pieces when they've all made it through the network. The identification field is the field that's used to link all of the different fragments together. They all bear the same identification value. And I've already talked about the importance of the MF flag, the more fragments flag here. Let's go through an example. That will probably make fragmentation clearer. So here I have a packet. It's a large packet, comes into a router. Let's say the MTU of the link beforehand was 2300 bytes, so a large packet came in. Now, when I talk about length here, I am just going to talk about the length of the data. Actually, the total length field on the IP packet includes the length of the header, so we would need to adjust things. But to keep this example simple, I'm just going to talk about length as though it refers to the data in a packet. So here, imagine I have a packet comes in. It has some identifier value, random one. Oh look, it's OX12EF. The length, the data length of this packet is 2300 bytes. It has an offset of 0 because it's not fragmented. It begins at position 0 at the beginning. And the more fragments bit is cleared since there's been no fragmentation. Now, for the outgoing link, let's say the MTU is 1500 bytes. It won't fit. What do? You guessed it, we fragment. We're going to have to break it into two pieces. The first piece we'll break it into is the largest size that will fit. Let's call that 1500. So I'm going to fill in we have a fragment here. Here's the fragment. This is the first piece. Let's fill in these fields. for the identification number, we just copy that, 12EF. The data length, I told you we'll try and send 1500 bytes. That's what we'll send in the first fragment. The offset is going to be 0 for the first piece. The more fragments flag will be set to 1 to indicate there is something coming. The second piece will be whatever's left over. Now, if the first piece is 1500 bytes, we've got another 800 bytes left to make up the packet. For the identifier, I copy it again. The offset we need to change. The offset should now be 1500 to indicate that this 800 bytes of data starts at position 1500. And the more fragments flag will be set to 0 to indicate that this is the last of the fragments. Okay, so if I clean that up a bit, you can see that example. And I've just highlighted there the fields which differ to show you that fragmentation has occurred and how they changed as the pieces were divided. That's fragmentation. You've seen an example of the procedure. Basically, it works. This design, by the way, has some clever properties. You might have wondered what will happen if we encounter another router where the MTU is even smaller. Well, this design allows fragments to be fragmented using exactly the same procedure and without having to group any packets together or do anything that would be hard work. However, and here's the issue really, it turns out that fragmentation is undesirable for many reasons. Experience with networks has shown us this. Fragmentation is more work for the routers and hosts compared to not doing it. For the routers, they're trying to process packets, millions of packets per second maybe. So it can be a lot of work to do. For hosts, they don't maybe have to process at such a long rate, but they have to buffer. They might have to hold on to pieces of packets for a long time to see if they can put them together and solve a jigsaw puzzle. Now, if you lose a fragment, you also lose the entire packet. There's no provision for retransmitting individual fragments. So this tends to magnify the loss rate and complicate things for the host, because if you lose any fragment, it might be holding a lot of the other fragments for a long time before it decides to give up. Fragmentation even causes security problems too. Fragmentation makes it easier to kind of hide the contents of what's in a packet. So it's more difficult for security boxes to check that the traffic isn't malicious. So let's move on and look at the alternate method that's used instead these days. And that is path MTU discovery. Really here we're trying to discover the largest MTU which will fit through the network. If we can do this, we avoid fragmentation. And this is the method that's in use today. Now the procedure we'll follow is here. The host is essentially going to try and send the data, and as a side effect it's going to test the network. It will send a large packet with the data it wants to get through. Hopefully that will get through. But if it doesn't, because it's too large, then routers will send feedback to the host telling it what size packet would have fit through the network. That way the host can discover how large packets it can send through the network. Here's an example. So let's just imagine we have a source on the left sending to a destination on the right. They're going through a couple of routers. The MTU of the first link is 1400 bytes. So on try number 1, the host might send 1400 bytes. It knows this is the MTU because it's attached to this link. So it just hopes this will fit through the network all the way to the destination. But as we go through the network, guess what? The first router, the MTU goes down. It's only 1200 bytes. This packet won't fit. Now, if this were fragmentation, we divide it into pieces and send them onwards, but this is not. This is path MTU discovery. So instead, the router sends back a message to the host saying, try 1200, and then it drops the packet. Host gets this message, and then it will try again. It will send another packet. This time it will resend packets with an MTU, a packet with an MTU of 1200 bytes. That will make it through the first router and to the second router. And when it gets to the second router, unfortunately it's too big because the MTU of the next link is 900 bytes, which is even smaller. Well, in this case, we'll send another feedback message. Now we'll say try 900 bytes. Okay, the host will get that message and these other two packets have been discarded. And the host will now try sending 900 bytes and it will go through the network all the way up. And eventually it will be received by the destination. The destination will then send a normal reply, and we won't get any error message from the network saying that we should try something smaller to fit our packet through. Here's a version that's cleaned up, and that's essentially path MTU discovery. Now this process might seem a little bit involved. There was a whole dance we do here with messages and negotiation to find the MTU along the network path. But actually it usually works fairly quickly to find the right size, because there are some common number of sizes and there usually aren't that many discontinuities we run into. You can also usually remember this information. You're doing it once maybe to talk to a destination, and it's usually fairly stable. So it works reasonably well in practice. It is, and this is interesting too, it's really, because the path MTU depends on the path and the path can change, the search is really an ongoing procedure. We're really performing the search in parallel with sending data. It may be the case that we stabilize at a path MTU and use it for a while, and then suddenly it changes, it gets smaller or possibly larger. We would like to discover that. So we might send a larger probe packet occasionally, and occasionally during the connection we may get error messages saying to use a smaller packet. You might wonder how all of this is implemented. This is implemented with a protocol called ICMP. That's the protocol that sends the error messages. We're going to talk about that next. And in addition to ICMP, one bit that's used that's key is this DF, don't fragment bit. To use path MTU discovery, hosts send packets with the don't fragment bit set. This tells routers not to fragment the pieces, and instead, if the packet is too large, this error message will be triggered, and that's our feedback. We'll see that soon.